Thank you everyone for coming to today's Synapse Science Communication Speaker Series. My name is Cindy. I'm the editor-in-chief at Synapse. I'm a third year DSCB student in the graduate sciences program. And I'm really happy to introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Jennifer Frazier. Jennifer is a well-known science communicator in the Bay Area and has a long history with UCSF. She received a PhD degree in cell biology here, and some of you may know her from the science communication mini course here at UCSF. I've personally had an opportunity to interact with Jennifer as well through the science policy mini course. And Jennifer's experiences include working with the Exploratorium as a senior scientist and curator, designer of public science experiences for the Science Communication Lab. Let's welcome Jennifer to speak about her experiences in science communication, outreach, and engagement. And there will be a short Q&A section after the talk. So Jennifer, please.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Cindy, for the nice introduction. And it's nice to see you again, and also to Sylvie and the rest of the Synapse team. I'm really happy to be here, even if it's in 2 dimensions. So what I'm planning on doing, I guess I can take off my name tag here, is I was going to give, sort of a short presentation that'll go over, I think there was some thought about, what it's like to work in science museums, or especially with a science background as a scientist creating things for the public, but really do it through also give you some practical tools and tips around how to engage with the public, even now if you're a student or postdoc or any other part of the scientific community. So it will not just be about me, but hopefully some things that you can take away as well. Okay, and will probably, since this is being recorded, maybe what I'll plan on doing is going through the slides, and then there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. We'll have a lot of room and time for discussion. So I will go ahead and just get started. But as I just said, I'm going to be talking today about engaging the public with science, and hopefully giving you some practical skills with what I'd call a quick start guide, with a lens on like designing things for museums. And as Cindy said, I'm currently a program officer at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and also an adjunct professor in the biochemistry department here, teaching a science communication mini course, usually in the spring quarters, and also participating in the science policy mini course. So today, I'm going to start briefly with why we need to engage the public. I think if anyone is attending this, I'm guessing they're already fairly interested in this topic. Sort of a brief, love letter to museums, science museums, and then looking at some ways that you can design your own science communication experiences with this framework, and then plenty of time for Q&A and discussion on anything that may have come up that's of interest to you. So I think right now, I don't want there to be like a slide of doom. There are a lot of graphs on this slide about showing declining trust in science. The question is, why engage the public with science? Even when I was a student, when there was still very, very high public support for and trust in science, it was still very much, how do we, a lot of our work is taxpayer funded, or we just love science. There's always been a desire to share what we do with the public, and also, again, if it's with taxpayer money, often a sense of responsibility. But I think in the last decade especially, there's an increasing urgency for those who work in the sciences or around the sciences to think about how public trust has declined, and especially among different demographics in the population. So on this slide, these are just different editorials or different articles. I'm sure you've seen many more, but that graph is showing how there's especially a decrease in trust in science that's along partisan lines. And we also see this in other communities, that, this isn't just broadly a decline in public trust, but it is particularly in different communities. So I think there's definitely, and especially given some of the things that we're seeing going on with science right now, nationally, real need for us to try to engage and think about how we help people understand what we do. So I think, one of the recommendations, I think all are aware that this is an issue, and a lot of organizations are trying to address this, right? Whether it's the National Academy of Sciences, American Association for the Advancement of Science, there have been lots of consortiums, a lot of research on, why is there this decline in public trust and what can we do to address it? And obviously it's an extremely large, complex issue that involves, a lot of sociocultural factors, political factors, and there's not just one solution, but one consensus does seem to be that scientists sharing more about their work, who they are, building more bridges with their communities, that across many of these reports that have been carried out, that is one of the recommendations. I mean, there are many, many things needed, but scientists being able to communicate clearly and well is one of the things that, is part of this multi-pronged approach to like rebuilding, increasing, or engaging with people around science. So I think, one idea is, it's easy to think, oh, well, museum exhibits or documentary films, sometimes there seems to be a very high bar in our minds of like how we can engage with the public in science. And actually, since we've been having technical challenges, maybe we'll save these for the end and I won't have you add it to the chat. But I think maybe just for a minute, try to envision, that it doesn't, what are the many ways where people may see science, that they may encounter science. It doesn't have to be that it's these like big, outreach or communication things we think of, but maybe it's like a TikTok channel. Maybe it's like a billboard or a bus stop. Maybe in this picture, it's like, I know some people wear t-shirts or hats and it sparks conversations in their communities. We don't always have to think of like public engagement or communicating with people to be sort of like this whole other side activity. It can be something that really is like woven into smaller interactions that we have, on an almost daily basis. And so, some of the things I'd touch on, these are just pictures of things that I've gotten the chance to do over my career, whether it's, I did an internship at Wired and got to work at Nova. As Cindy said, I've gotten to design a lot of museum exhibits, but those are even, as a career professional, there's just such a wide range. And I think that's one thing I hope all of you take away today is that there are just so many ways that you can engage with people or communicate. And it's almost as like, if you can think of all the ways you might like to communicate with others, you might be able to communicate science. So one of the things, because there was this interest in learning a little bit more about museums, I thought I would talk about this area in particular for engaging the public. And as Cindy mentioned, I had been a curator and senior scientist at the Exploratorium for 18 years. So that was a place when I was in graduate school. I had grown up going to science museums. I mean, I think if most people have spent some time in a nature center or science center, but they really do have a lot of unique affordances for engaging the public. And, and I think if you think of them, they're actual physical spaces, which these days can be fairly rare for our experiences, but you can see authentic phenomena. This is, an old-fashioned picture of a brontosaurus skeleton, but you can see like real things, right? Imagine like it's a moon rock, the Hope Diamond, like brontosaurus skeleton, like you actually get access to some of the specimens or things from different areas. You can interact with real scientific tools. So here's a picture of the microscope imaging station at the Exploratorium, where this is a chance for people to actually do science. You can interact with real scientific tools, and instead of someone just telling you, here's what a cell is, you actually can drive a microscope around and get to experience and look at what a cell is. You can actually meet scientists. So here's a demonstration with, this was at the time, a postdoc in Wallace Marshall's lab from UCSF coming and doing a program at the Exploratorium. And, again, museums are places where most Americans and generally around the world, most people have not ever met a scientist. So again, in places like museums or in other community settings, people actually have a chance to meet a scientist and realize, they're real people with different backgrounds, needs, interests, senses of humor. So it can kind of like demystify who and what scientists are. A lot of museums also have places where people can have sort of like interesting immersive experiences. This is going inside a chloroplast at the planetarium at Cal Academy in San Francisco. And there are also spaces where people can have social or multi-generational learning. So that I think when we think of places where people learn science or even read about or hear about science, it's often very siloed, right? It's in school or it's in a magazine or a newspaper. It's often done in isolation or by age group. And so another thing that, I really love about the museum environment is that there can be this social and multi-generational learning. So that's sort of just like a backdrop of, museums as a place where you can kind of design all these different sorts of science experiences. And, just touching on again, there's sort of like a little snapshot. And you might already be noticing this is not something you have to think about deeply, but since I'm starting to use these terms interchangeably, one thing I realize is there are sort of these three related but separate fields. I'm using them interchangeably and you can too, but just so you know, in the field, there's science communication is often thought of as like sharing information, sort of those more traditional newspapers, documentary film, social media. Often it's a little bit more one way. People use the term public engagement. It's often more two-way exchange. Like this, whoever's doing the presenting is trying to learn as much from the audience as the audience is learning from the presenter. So there's that real idea of like bi-directional communication. And informal science education, which is really much more museums or like after school programs, often they're not just about maybe giving scientific content, but often thinking of learning goals. Like we want people to make an observation. This is more just for you, a little bit about the fields. Some people use these terms interchangeably, but they are sometimes thought of differently, and the type of research done on them is a little bit different. But I usually just refer to them as science communication because later today, when we talk about jargon, if I were out in the community and people said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I do public engagement. You'd be like, what does that actually mean? Or what is informal science learning? So sometimes I just use science communication as a catch-all because it's like, oh, you're communicating science and it makes it easier for people to know what you're doing. So again, making this hopefully useful to you and not just about what I've done, I'm going to present a science communication framework that's adapted from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who had done a lot of work around public engagement and science communication. And I'm going to give anecdotes from my work in museums, so you sort of get a chance to not only learn some things that might be useful to you, but a little bit more about how this work is done in museums. So the overall, framework is probably very similar to designing a scientific experiment, right? You're going to plan what you're doing, implement it, and then hopefully evaluate or reflect on whether it worked or not and what you need to do next as part of your iterative cycle. And so when we're doing this for science communication, the first part of the planning, is really thinking about these things around what's your goal, who is your audience, and what is the medium that you might use, right? As we sort of talked about earlier, maybe it's video, maybe it's like one-on-one conversation, maybe it's a demonstration in a local community center. So you're going to think, you really want to like plan and scope for what it is that you want to do. Now, I think when I was in graduate school thinking about like, oh, I want to share science, the goal often, what do you really hope is going to happen? I think the one that dominates people's minds usually is inform. Oh, I'm doing this really cool thing and I want to share it. Oh, everyone needs to know this about molecular evolution or how neurons work. Yes, that is extremely useful. And a lot of times we are excited to inform people, but the goals can be very much broader, right? We can be about spurring action, being in dialogue with people in our communities, mentoring early career scientists, helping people like learn what the process of science is, helping them see who scientists are. So there can be a lot of different goals, and it's good to sort of sit back and think about like what you would really like to accomplish when you're planning an activity. And, the example I'm going to use from museums is an exhibition I designed when the Exploratorium moved to a new building that was called Living Liquid. And this was about marine microbes, so microbes that live in the ocean, which, most people commonly refer to as plankton. That's sort of the, not scientifically accurate, but more common term for them. And we did a whole exhibition area. You can see some of the snapshots there with like photos on the wall, interactive exhibits, the data table. And I'll use this as an example of, how we set goals. So working with a lot of different scientists and doing a lot of reading of the literature. So this was an area where I could really like draw on my background as a PhD student, learning how to look at reviews and who are the good people in the field and working with them to really synthesize like, well, what might our goals for this exhibition be? And based on this, the input from experts, it was like, okay, the most important thing they thought to get across to the public was highlighting the diversity and abundance of marine microbes. And that's even where, I got the idea for the title Living Liquid, because it literally was that any drop of water, lake, or in this case, the marine environment, is full of life, millions, if not billions of life forms. For the Exploratorium, which is very focused on, hands-on science, we also wanted to make sure that it provided an opportunity for people to use real scientific tools. And another like science goal was helping people understand that living things are intimately connected to their environments, which I think as someone who'd worked in a biomedical research lab had not been front of mind, but especially things, in the environment, a change in salinity, a change in dissolved oxygen levels dramatically changes what's living in the water. So that was, we set the goals both based on what our institution needed and input from our scientific experts. And even then on like individual exhibit levels, that's kind of a zoom in on that interactive. This was a collaboration with the MIT Darwin Project and a computer science lab at UC Davis, where this is showing the different colors are different types of plankton living in the world's oceans. So that's a map of the world's oceans. And it basically was looping through time. It was a real scientific simulation, and visitors could explore this with these glass lenses to look at what kind of marine microbes were living at the ocean in different places at different times. So this really would allow them to kind of get some of these concepts around, what lives in the ocean, how is it related to the environment, and also let them make their own discoveries and observations. So that was an example of, one specific piece where we set those goals. On sort of like the career side of, what's it like being a scientist in a museum? As I said, one of the things that I really have loved about working in museums or in science communication is a lot of these things are done in teams. I mean, usually a much larger project like an exhibition or exhibit. So this was, getting to go out sampling with U.S. Geologic Survey, marine microbiologists on San Francisco Bay, lab visits, getting to go see these simulations at MIT, working with computer scientists from UC Davis. So sort of on the career side, making these goals happen, you get to work with a really broad range of skill sets and teams. I think, another really important thing that I've emphasized in the science communication classes is it's great to have a goal, but you also really want to make that goal work for your audience. Because even when we were talking about public trust in science, the public is not a monolith. There's not just like one group of people out there that all have the same interests, motivations, prior knowledge, or maybe even biases. It's age ranges. There's a lot of range in like who we're talking about. So it's good to think about, how do you design for your audience? So this was a slide from the policy course at UCSF. So they're a little policy focused, but things like how you're going to communicate with like a House subcommittee might be really different than how you're going to be talking to like a school board, right? So you just want to think in advance. If you have a goal, who's your audience and how are you going to be making this work for your audience? So 2 examples from museums. The Exploratorium, we did a big plants exhibition and programmatic series. And we realized, one of the overall objectives of the museum at the time was to increase how many of our Latinx community were coming to the museum. So the number was much, even though the Bay Area population of, the Latinx community was over 30%, around 5% were coming to the museum. And so the museum had a goal and a Latinx audience engagement initiative for increasing the number of visitors who felt, who wanted to come to the museum, felt welcome in the museum. And that committee had spent a lot of time looking at the literature on, what makes people want to come or not come to a museum. And based on a lot of the like research that they had done, we knew that doing things in Spanish and on culturally relevant samples or like stories in other museums and other contexts had increased like visitorship. So this is an example where, we knew we wanted to like increase this audience and make the museum more relevant to the audience. And during COVID, we did a bunch of experiments around the plants show. And this was one of them where it was about how climate change is affecting cacao in Latin America. So we did a lot on the science of cacao and picked that as a plant sample. And then had one of our scientists, staff scientists, Isabel Hawkins, did a Spanish language program on, the cultural relevance of cacao and climate impacts. So thinking about audience, this was that we drew on the literature of how to what seemed to be strategies for making an audience want to be more involved in a museum, and then implemented that. Another example, this was wanting to make another exhibit within that plants show reachable and understandable for children. So that close up, those little shapes, that's glitter. And you might think, oh, okay, why does a science museum have a museum slide of glitter? Well, we realized, so we had these sort of like big slides that one of our exhibit designers had made with a lot of different plant pieces in it. And you could put it under this very simple microscope and see, as you can kind of see there on that screen, it was like flower petals up close. You could look at pollen. But one of the things we realized is that some of these things, as soon as especially our younger visitors get on a microscope, it's so unfamiliar. It was so hard to like understand that they'd zoomed in. And one strategy that we'd heard worked and had tested quite a few times is taking really familiar objects so that especially younger audiences could use those as a starting point. Like, oh, I know what glitter is. I know what it looks like. Oh, wow, that's what it looks like magnified. So pages from books or glitter or Band-Aids, dollar bills, all these things didn't make it into the exhibit, but into some of the prototypes, where we knew that for younger audiences, it was much easier to get into a microscopy exhibit if you start with something familiar. So I guess for those of you who've done lots of demos, don't start with onion skin cells because people don't know what those are. So I think the other thing, as we talked about, is considering which medium is going to help you. If you've set a goal, like I want people to know this or that about neurons, or I want to open a dialogue, you've thought about which audience you might want to reach, then you spend some time thinking about, the medium, like what format could this take? And, again, kind of using some museum examples, the picture in the middle, again, is that, that demonstration where there was a UCSF postdoc coming in and talking about cilia in a demonstration. That is something where it's like, oh, okay, well, we want people to be able to ask their questions. We want more dialogue and engagement with the visitors. So you might not have as many people, but they're getting to meet a scientist. They're getting to ask their own questions. So something like a demonstration or those small formats, that medium can be great for sort of personalizing science and really engaging with people in small groups. I talked about the exhibit on the left with that kind of like visualization and the goal of that, an exhibit is a great place where people can do their own discovery. If your goal is really for people to make their own insights, you want to create a freestanding experience like an exhibit. And then, the picture where that's me in front of a giant made up human of microbes, that was something that was much more information. That was a talk. We noticed that a lot of our visitors were really interested in the human microbiome, and especially, like the gut-brain connection or different things about diet. So for one of our adult evening programs, I developed a talk that a lot of people found very useful on just like a primer on the human microbiome. So again, this is like, okay, the audience is adults. The goal is to share information. So you just think a little bit about like which medium is going to help you with your goal and your audience. Then, you can have these lofty ideas, but then of course it's just like an experiment. There's actually implementing it and making sure that it's going to work. And there you're going to think about resources and, clarifying your message. So this is just sort of sounds like common sense, but I think thinking first, a lot of times, especially if you're just getting started in science communication, knowing, what are my assets, like my connections or the things that I know or things I'm already really good at. So that picture is from a program series I did during COVID called COVID Conversations, where because I'd been a student at UCSF, I already knew a lot of the UCSF community and was able to access, that's Dr. Kirsten Bibbins Domingo, who's in the medical school and the chair of epidemiology and biostatistics. It was much easier because I'd been at UCSF to reach out to people, to ask them to be on the show. I'm sure they would have said yes anyway, but I think I felt a lot more comfortable reaching out to the community. I knew from my background in cell biology, it was easy for me to kind of like navigate what was going on with COVID. I'm not sure I would say what my talents are or not, but I think for you, again, it's getting at, if you're not comfortable doing video, don't make yourself do YouTube videos. If you love writing, maybe you're writing, like you want to make sure that whatever you're doing sort of aligns with what you might find interesting or rewarding so that it's not sort of a forced fit. And then even if it's something small that you're doing as a graduate student or a postdoc, it's still good to think about what kind of time you realistically have. Don't commit to doing a demonstration at the Maker Faire if that's also when you have, a paper due, or it's again, it's a little bit common sense, but even I myself have found that, sometimes it's easy to be aspirational and then realize that you don't have the budget for all the materials or the time. So just being realistic. And, I think this came through with some of the earlier exhibit photo that I showed, but we may want to cover all of it, right? Like, oh, we use data visualizations to do science. There's all these marine microbes you need to know, but there's so many things we want to share. We get really excited, but usually, especially if it's with a short interaction, like a demonstration or exhibit, it's good to pick really one thing you want to get across. So these are two examples. One is Cells to Scale, which was a series of bronze models in the Cells to Self exhibition at the Exploratorium, where the one in front is the size of an oocyte, and then that long column is like a human hair, which is obviously not one cell, but keratin. But the table is filled with like relatively scaled cells. And so it's just very simple. It's like people can go and see that there's a range of cell sizes. And the other image is from an exhibit I did called Seasons of Plankton, which was just, as you can imagine from the title, plankton actually have seasons. They're like changing throughout the year. So keeping it simple. And this is, if you take any science communication primer, it would definitely be don't use jargon. And that's an example of an original article, from, I don't know, is it Nature or Science? And then the New York Times version, you definitely want to use words that people are familiar with. And I think I've even seen examples where people think people know what a mitochondria or a nucleus or a chromosome are, even words that we think of as pretty straightforward. If someone's been out of school for a long time, they may have forgotten what those are. So just make sure you're always defining whichever terms you're using. I think the last piece is with really like getting a sense of whether something worked or not. And, in the public engagement, museum world, we would call this evaluation, but there are even ways you can do it when you're trying your own activities that are both, I will talk about some informal methods and then talk about what we do kind of like in the field as far as formal evaluation. Informal, again, this sounds a little bit like common sense, but I think sometimes it's easy to not take the time. It's just reflection. Even after you give a group meeting or a poster, or if you do some kind of like activity in the community, even just taking a little bit of time to think, how did that land? Did people ask good questions? Like, did people seem like they were getting lost? It's good to think a little bit about what may have worked or not, especially if it's something where like you had colleagues present, you can ask them for honest feedback, and they might tell you, oh, that part was a little bit confusing, that was too long. And then, if it's something that can be measured, like social media or a piece that you've written, you can even if it's anecdotal evidence, you can still get a sense of like what was the reach or how many people looked at it. In like the film museum, other kind of like larger scale projects, we do a lot of what was more formal evaluation. And you often work with people who are trained as social scientists, like science learning or science communication. There are whole fields of people who do studies and have research questions in these areas, or evaluators, right? And so again, these people are trained not only in framing research questions, but also in like, human subject protocols or how to ask questions without biasing people. So you can then collect data through various methods. So there might be surveys, or that other little more complex image there is software that we use to do a study on whether that data visualization exhibit had actually sparked visitor questions. There were video cameras and microphones and tracking. Of course, people knew this was happening, but there are a lot of ways that you can collect data. And that was one thing I think, especially about working in museums, and this is also true in some other areas of science communication. If you choose and you get grants and partner with social scientists, you, just like you do in like biochemistry or cell biology, you can actually like develop new knowledge that you then can contribute to the field. So, this wasn't necessarily about cell division, but on some of the exhibitions I've done at the Exploratorium, partnering with these social scientists, we develop a research question, collect data, write papers, host convenings and workshops to develop research agendas for the field. So I think that's, one aspect of this career that I've really enjoyed, probably especially since I was trained as a scientist, is kind of pushing the fields of knowledge, not just developing things to engage the public or help share science, but also doing kind of like these bigger studies on what actually works or doesn't work so that we can improve practice and develop new insights. And so now, I'm going to stop soon so that you can ask me questions, but I, have really loved working in all these different environments like, Nova or magazines, all of these different areas offer sort of different forms and experiences. And in the last few months, I've started a new role as a program officer at the Moore Foundation in what's called the Curiosity Driven Science Initiative, which is really similar. It's not just, for museums, it's really about creating tools that foster scientific discovery. And in a role like this, it's not so much that I'm the one doing the development now, but really helping to think about what, taking in ideas for new projects and thinking about, ways to have impact. So that's, something I'm happy to talk about too. But if anyone wants to reach out to me, I have some worksheets around, how to develop these activities. And I'm happy to hear from you. So that's my personal email. I'm not on X anymore, but have been starting to experiment with Blue Sky if you're on there. And I think just pictures of plankton and plants and exhibits, more image-driven things I've put on Instagram, and I'm happy to share all that or make sure that our Synapse hosts can share that. But at this point, I will stop sharing so that you can ask me questions. Thanks so much. Oh, let me escape here. Okay. So I don't know if how normally, Cindy, but do you guys do questions with raised hands or people can just ask me any questions they might have?
Yes, so I think if people are comfortable asking over their mic, you can feel free to do so. Maybe raise your hand so that I can call upon you.
Sure. Yeah, great. I'm happy to answer any questions like about the framework or different types of like careers or working in museums. I mean, anything people are curious about. Or this is the informal feedback. If no one has any questions, then that means I didn't push it the right way, which is okay. Because I can just send you things. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, I see from Christina in the chat. I'm wondering what you'd recommend to get more experience in the field, for example, like internships or fellowships. You recommend particularly during graduate school or immediately post-grad. All right, Christina, I'm happy. So I can share a couple examples, but also for the students in my science communication course, I have a list of local small opportunity. I have a resource that I share with the students, which I'm happy to give to this team to distribute to the list of people who signed up, which I'm guessing would include you. There are quite a few, I think if you want on that list, there's a lot of small scale things where you can like volunteer, again, there's like the Maker Fair, there's Nerd Night, there's all the different science museums and community events. So I have them listed on that resource, but also if you think about wherever it is that you're living, in San Francisco or beyond, there are a lot of science related events where if you want to just do something small scale, you can volunteer and get experience that way. And even, like, I don't know that Synapse is always taking writers, but, just anything. I think the thing I usually recommend to people is even if you're going to be applying for a fellowship or internship, you're much more likely to get it if you've already shown a commitment to this kind of work. If you're applying for some of the fellowships or internships I'll mention, and you basically only have lab experience, you probably are not going to get it. It's good to already, it's kind of like that bootstrapping of showing, oh, I've written this blog, or I've written this for Synapse, or I've done these at my community center, or I volunteer at this school. It's always good to show that like you're experimenting with and trying to do some kinds of things. So again, I can share resources, or it's really just looking at anything where they're doing science engagement or there's an opportunity to communicate. Some of the more well-known internships, so AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, does have a mass media fellowship, which I have, and I know that someone from UCSF got one a year or two ago as well. I'm sure that many alumni have gotten these. That's an entire summer where you go through a lot of like really in-depth training with the AAAS, and you're part of a cohort, and then you get assigned for an entire summer to do a science communication internship. So that's one of the most, well-known that I can think of off the top of my head. Also, a lot of people, again, if you reach out to me or I'll share this resource, there are a lot of like smaller organizations that often post summer internships, like Scientific American often will have like summer residents or fellows. So a lot of these things, if you start following some of the well-known or larger outlets for science communication, often they will post when they have opportunities for internships or fellowships, but those are just the two that come top of mind. And the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship, you actually have to be an active graduate student or have not graduated. So to get to your question about during grad school or post grad. And the one thing I'd also say about this that I always advise students is I did the same thing with my graduate advisor because I did start to do some of these things during graduate school. It's always really good to communicate with your advisor. You don't want to suddenly not be there every Friday because you're volunteering in a science classroom or suddenly drop on them that you might be gone for the summer doing a mass media fellowship. It's like really important. You're in their lab, very likely on one of their grants. And in my experience, it's just good to communicate with them because, they're your mentor and hopefully they are supportive. But also, it can I've seen it lead to a lot of tension if all of a sudden you're just sort of not there, especially for a whole summer. So that's just one caveat to make sure people think of in their planning. Are there other questions? Either you can ask over the mic or in the chat.
I think Zoe had a question.
Oh, great. Yeah. And then yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I guess I was kind of curious. You talked specifically about trying to engage Latinx communities at the Exploratorium. And I was curious, I guess, one, if you noticed that it worked, and then two, sort of, I guess, to talk about it from like sort of a like drug development perspective, like what was the durability of the effect? Did that, after the exhibit was running, did that hold up or did people stop coming? And does the Exploratorium kind of make an effort to continually re-engage those communities?
Right. Okay. No, these are great questions. And I'm speaking, whatever data I'm talking about is not something that I've looked at recently. So I'm speaking in sort of more general terms, and I don't work at the Exploratorium anymore. So this is just me knowing what I knew at the time. But to answer your question, it actually did work. So this was this much larger. So they have this ongoing, it was the Latino Audience Engagement Committee, then it was the Latinx Audience Engagement Committee. To be completely transparent, I don't know, given what's going on in the current landscape, what is happening with that initiative. And, so I can't speak for what is going on in the current moment, but that they have a number of events, like during the year. There's Dia de las Madres for Mother's Day and Latinx Engineering Day in the fall, which are free and everything's in Spanish and it's featuring like a lot of, Latinx scientists. So there already was a lot going on with this committee where they've been doing a lot of like great work to build up visitorship. But it was increasing, but with that plants show, which was called Plantasticas, we did do an evaluation and there was an observable spike in the number of Latinx audience members that were coming. So it absolutely like worked from that perspective of increasing visitors. And I do have the evaluation, so I'm happy to share it with you. And it might be, I haven't checked recently, still on the Exploratorium website, where Latinx audience members felt more welcomed, they felt more engaged. Like a lot of the strategies that were used within that exhibition that had been based on literature did work. Your question about durability of effect, I don't know that they've looked at that since, right? So it was sort of like there was a show, there was a grant, they looked, there was an increase, people felt more welcome. Interestingly, some other visitors were confused about why did you pick the Latinx audience? And I don't understand, they didn't understand the rationale. So that was another thing that evaluation picked up. But those are great questions. So it was heartening that something that had been a goal of that exhibition worked, but I don't know that they've looked at, then did it stay higher, right? If there was this big increase, did it stay elevated? Did it drop halfway? Did it have a lasting effect? I'm not sure that that's been looked at, but that's a great question.
Definitely just from the perspective of trying to reach minority kind of audiences, it feels like it's something where you don't just want it to be like a one-off thing. You want it to
Right.
be like continually making sure that you're
Yes.
providing for other audiences as well. And that's something that I'm personally pretty interested in.
No, that's a great one. I think that's something that, again, that's why there's again, at the time, me speaking from past experience, what was really great about having that committee, which was made up of Latinx staff. It was like this long term, I mean, more than a decades long commitment with events twice a year, fostering, it was so that it felt like this is something every year, all the time. And then with that exhibition, trying to make more of a floor presence, because you're right, no one wants to feel that, oh, you're just coming for that one Sunday streets and then you're never going to see them again, or you just did the one show. So I think that's really important, is thinking about a like prolonged commitment. So it's good to be thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no, good question.
How long did you feel like it took for you to build an instinct for like what's a great idea for us, like a great exhibit or um an outreach activity as you transition from uh, getting a PhD and then into science communication?
That's a great question. I mean, probably the most important, I didn't emphasize this as much in the slides, but I think one thing that's really important, which I still catch myself, you never really get over this. It's very easy to be kind of in love with your own ideas, like, oh my gosh, cell division and these micrographs, they're the most beautiful, amazing thing I've ever seen. And that's good. Your enthusiasm and excitement as a scientist or your own passion for something sometimes is what makes something amazing, right? Like, I guess like if any of you have ever seen videos of like Richard Feynman, the physicist, right? He wasn't worrying about, is this relevant and how do I tell a narrative? Like his enthusiasm and excitement was what I think captivated a lot of people. So you don't want to dull that down too much. But I think to your point, what's helped me evolve a bit over my career is learning how to like step back a little bit and think, well, is that really a good idea? Is that, and I think that's one of those things, like maybe people who are interested in this area, most people who go into science communication or public engagement already like doing this, right? You don't tend to gravitate toward a career that you're not already sort of good at or interested in. It's often people who liked storytelling, liked teaching, liked writing. There is some part of you that always liked sharing or explaining or engaging with people. So I think the thing that happens over time is you start to become more aware of not just like what you're excited about, but kind of getting a chance to practice how it works with the different audiences across the different mediums. So when you ask, I guess, like, how long did it take? I mean, I think it's something I still try to pay attention to, like I think of something that I think would be a great idea. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute, is that actually really a good idea? So I think it's just, you probably have those instincts and it's a matter of getting a chance to practice them and see, and being open to failing. You try something, you're like, oh, wow, that didn't really go that well. So I think I think it goes faster. Honing your instincts goes faster if you're more willing to be honest with yourself about whether something worked or not, and practicing and being able to step back and not be too attached to your ideas. But I'm still not always great at that. So you don't have to be perfect from the get-go. And thanks so much for coming and for caring about this, because not necessarily that every scientist should communicate. I think, not everybody's good at everything, but for those of us who do have a desire or aptitude or some talents in this area, you're very needed. Even if it's just talking to your uncles or somebody at the playground or your yoga class, the more people see that scientists are caring human beings doing things in the world, you don't have to make a documentary film. Just being a good listener and showing up is hopefully going to chip away at some of our issues. So thanks so much for being here, and to Cindy and Sylvie for hosting.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, as well. I really enjoyed the presentation.
All right. Well, I look forward, hang in there, everybody. And thanks so much for being here.